All right, starting second part. So let's go ahead and, okay, am I still presenting? Okay, right. Here we go. So we finished with crinoids. Asteroids you're much likelier to have seen if you've ever been to a beach or a rocky coastline. These are the true starfish. And a typical starfish has a central body called the central disc and arms radiating out of the disc, usually five, although as we've already seen, there are some that kind of go overboard a little bit with arms. I think the record is actually an Antarctic species that clocks in at over 50, but five is the most common number. The arms don't have a sharp distinction between the arms and the disc. The disc just usually just kind of grades into the arms, but there's not a sharp division between where one ends and the other begins. The coelom extends deep into the arms, and so do these branches of the stomach called the pyloric ceca. A cecum is Latin for blind thing. Cecus was the adjective meaning blind, and it's commonly used to mean any sort of blind pouch. You've got a cecum, it's the blind pouch where your small intestine feeds into your large intestine, and then the appendix kind of branches off the cecum. So you've got this too. This is another term that maybe the pre-meds ought to remember. You know, seek them and ye shall find them. Okay. Respiration is through those dermal gills or papillae that we've already seen. Locomotion's almost entirely by podia. Arm movements may help, but most of the work of moving around is done by the podia. So starfish can appear to kind of glide over a surface, and they may not move their arms very much at all. A very common feeding mode is the starfish will wrap its arms around something it wants to eat and turn a portion of the stomach inside out through the mouth, a portion called the cardiac stomach, which is folded up inside the body, kind of like a parachute. It'll turn that inside out through the mouth and digest the food right outside the body. Starfish will do this with soft food. Starfish that feed on clams can use those arms to pull a clam apart, and the clam is trying to hold itself shut with its muscles. But starfish can use the water vascular system and the catch collagen to hang on and not get tired. So eventually the clam's muscles tire, the shell gapes open a little bit, and then the starfish turns its stomach inside out and digests the clam directly inside its shell and just absorbs it right there. Not all starfish can do this, but this is a pretty common thing that they do. Right, there we go. There we don't go. There we go. And here's a fairly typical one. This is from, I believe, the Baltic Sea in Northern Europe. The painted starfish, and I just picked it because it's got your very typical starfish body form. The oral disc is basically orange, and then the white and orange striped things are the arms. And you can see there's not a sharp line between them. Within that orange oral disc, you can see a little white spot. That's the madreporite. That's the intake for the water vascular system right there. And it's one of the few parts of the starfish that is not perfectly radially symmetrical. It's not dead center in the disc. But yeah, that's your typical starfish body form. There are some where there's a trend to arm reduction. This is a Pacific species. It's one of my favorites, the pincushion starfish, with extremely short arms there. I've seen there's a similar species that I think is called the cookie cutter starfish that's also got very short arms and looks like something that your grandma might bake for Christmas. One of the weirdest starfish is right here. This was only found in 1986. They're tiny, and they're adapted to live on waterlogged wood in the deep ocean. So if a tree, washes into the ocean and nothing destroys it, it'll eventually get completely waterlogged and it'll sink. And apparently Xyloplax medusiformis is one of a unique set of critters that are adapted to live on waterlogged wood in the very deep ocean. We don't know much about how it makes its living. It actually has, the mouth is so wide open that basically the stomach is the whole lower membrane of the body. It doesn't have a mouth you can even close. It retains juvenile features all the way through maturity. I talk about this a little more in my evolution class, but if you have juvenile features that are retained in a sexually mature adult, that's called pedomorphosis. And it was originally placed in the 6th class of echinoderms, but it's now considered just a really damn weird starfish. So one of the more extreme types of starfish you might find. And here's a more typical one. This is a pretty typical starfish that you'd see if you could dissect it. The water vascular system is shown in that darker blue or purple. In the arm, you can see, on the arm that's opened up on the left, you can see an ambulacrum, that row of holes for the tube feet to pass out. In bright blue, kind of covering most of the ambulacrum, you can see those are gonads. And then the digestive tract is shown in that deep yellow orange. And that star-shaped thing in the middle is the stomach. The cardiac stomach is closer to the mouth, and that's the part that can be turned inside out and extended out of the mouth. The upper part of the stomach, the pyloric stomach, is fixed in place, and the pyloric stomach is where those 5 forked branches come off, the pyloric ceci, one of which goes down each arm. It's been removed in the arm on the left, but you can see it in its natural position in the arm on the right. And then the anus extends up at the top, it would normally would normally open out on the skin, but that's been removed for purposes of dissection. So that's your basic starfish anatomy. There you've got the underside of a starfish that has turned its cardiac stomach inside out and everted it through the open mouth. Starfish could use this to feed on a lot of things. I've seen starfish feed on just soft tissue. When we used to keep them in one of my labs in grad school, they'd feed them on pieces of fresh squid. They just crawl up and turn their stomach inside out and slurp up that squid. But they can also use this to feed on clams if they open up a clam shell. Most starfish are really good at regenerating lost arms. This is an Atlantic starfish, genus Asteroids. That orange dot is the madreporite. This is a starfish that's lost 3 of its arms. And here you have 3 little stubby arms that are in the process of regenerating. In Asteroids, as little as 1 arm and 1/5 of the disc is enough to regenerate into a whole starfish, although not all starfish are quite that good. In fact, in species of genus Lynchia, Lynchia periodically drops arms off The word for that, by the way, is autotomy. You'll see that word again if you've ever seen a lizard um, get snagged by a predator, or maybe a curious 6-year-old and get picked up by the tail. You might know that the tail can fall off and the lizard can run away, and the tail can keep, twitching and keep the cat distracted. I think that happens in our yard quite a lot. So autotomy is deliberately dropping a body part. Lynchia periodically autotomizes arms, and a single arm can regenerate an entire new starfish. So what you're looking at there is a detached arm of Lynchia multifora growing a new body. So that's an arm that is regenerating a new oral disc and four more arms. So yeah, imagine a detached starfish arm singing, "Can anybody find me somebody to love?" Still got the high notes. I don't know if you're amused, but I'm entertained massively. Right. So, yeah, that's probably the most extreme feat of regeneration, where these starfish can deliberately reproduce asexually, routinely do it just by dropping off arms and letting each arm regrow a body. One of the more infamous starfishes, because it periodically has these population explosions, is Acanthaster plankii, one of the ones that isn't restricted to 5 arms, but has what looks to be about 12, with a very large oral disc and relatively short arms. This is affectionately known as the crown of thorns starfish. And those ossicles that are extended into thorns, they do hurt, and they have got some venom. So you do not want to step on one of these. I don't think they'd kill you, but it's a lot more painful than just the physical damage to your foot would be. And Acanthaster plankii feeds on live corals by just turning its stomach right inside out and just digesting the coral tissue right there where it is. You can see that there's this white patch that is coral tissue. That's dead coral where the living tissue has just been completely digested away by these starfish. And as long as the numbers are fairly low, the reef can survive that. New coral can just colonize the old coral and regenerate fairly quickly. Coral plannulas can just settle on top of the dead skeleton and start growing some more live skeleton. The problem is that since the 1950s, there have been these population explosions of Acanthaster plankii that can devastate Pacific reefs. There was one outbreak in the Philippines where they collected 87,000 of these from one single beach. Now, there's a great story that unfortunately I'm not sure is quite likely to pan out, but let me tell it first. The story goes that in Australia, when one of these outbreaks hit, they got a bunch of volunteers to go around on the reef and collect as many crown of thorns starfish as they could. They probably couldn't collect nearly enough to make much difference, but they tried. And at the end of the day, they ended up with buckets full of crown of thorns starfish, which you can't really do anything with. You can't eat them. They're dangerous even to handle because of those venomous thorns. So they chopped them up and threw them back in the water. Okay, think about it for a minute. If you chop up a starfish, what you basically get is more starfish. So they ended up being kind of like Mickey in the animated version of The Sorcerer's Apprentice in the Disney movie Fantasia. Remember that? He's enchanted a broom to fetch his water, but he can't figure out how to get the broom to stop. So he chops it into pieces, and then each piece becomes a new broom. and they all start marching into the castle and flooding it with the water that they're carrying. You know, dun 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 dun. Watch it sometime. It's part of Fantasia. It's fun. Great animation, great music. Anyway, I tend to doubt the story because Acanthaster is actually not nearly as good at regenerating as some other starfish. So if you chopped up one of these, I don't think most of the fragments would end up as new starfish. They're not as good as Lynchia, for example, but it still makes a very nice story. And this shows you the kind of things that can happen. Each population explosion can wipe out 90% of the coral in the affected region. You know, you can't poison the starfish without poisoning everything else on the reef. And when there's as many as 87,000 on one beach, you just can't pull them all off by hand. You know, it's just not efficient to do that. You can see live coral in an outbreak in French Polynesia up at the top. That's live coral in 2007. In October 2009, after one of these outbreaks, it doesn't look that different, except those corals are dead. And if they look a little bit darker green to you, it's because they're overgrown by algae. And then a tropical cyclone in 2010 wrecked the dead coral skeletons. Live coral might be broken up by a cyclone and some of it might die, but broken pieces of live coral can actually regenerate into new colonies. Dead coral, on the other hand, can't do anything. And so after that cyclone, what had been a thriving coral reef was reduced to a wasteland. Coral will eventually grow back, but on the Great Barrier Reef, it takes 8 to 10 years for corals to come back and replace that algae that overgrows dead coral. So reefs can recover, but it takes a long time, and they may suffer pretty severe damage before they're able to grow back. So there's another crown of thorns starfish. There are some fish that will eat it with very, very strong mouths. And if those fish get overfished, there may be nothing to keep Acanthaster in check. There's also the fact that increased nutrient runoff from land can drive population explosions of Acanthaster. And that's made worse by bad farming practices. If you're farming in such a way that you end up with a lot of fertilizer washing off, you know, into rivers and then into the ocean ultimately, that can cause or contribute to Acanthaster planki outbreaks. So another reason to go see coral reefs while you have the time. This is one of the things that threatens them. Right, whoops. Next group, ophiuroids. Ophion is ancient Greek for a snake. And these are sometimes called serpent stars because the arms are narrow and very flexible and look very much, for reasons you'll see in a minute, like wriggling snakes. I remember turning over a rock once in Baja California, and I thought I'd spotted a nest of snakes. It turned out to be a large and not very happy ophiuroid that I'd disturbed. So the body has these very long arms and then a central disc that is well separated from the arms, unlike starfish where there's no clear boundary between the two. There are podia without suckers, but locomotion is almost entirely by movements of the arms. Starfish arms are not rigid, but they don't move very fast and they don't have a huge range of motion typically. Ophiuroid arms can go every which way but loose. The arms are very limber. They easily break off or autotomize and ultimately grow back. And they look snaky because there are big ossicles inside the arms that take up all of the space inside them. So you don't have these extensions of the gut going into the arms. And the ossicles are fused together into big structures called vertebrae. They're not evolutionarily related to the vertebrae of vertebrates, but superficially they look a lot like them. And so the reason why ophiuroid arms look serpent-like is that what's supporting them is these ossicles that look a lot like snake vertebrae, although there's no evolutionary connection. And the arms are slender, and they're pretty much filled with interlocking vertebrae, so the gut does not extend into the arms. That's another difference between these and true starfish. The gut is blind. The anus has been lost. And there's some internal sacs with openings to the outside called bursae. Bursa, by the way, is Latin for a purse. Some universities have a bursar, who's basically the chief financial officer, the guy who's in charge of the purse. If a business or a university pays you money, they might call it a disbursement. If you've ever heard that word, to disburse. Disburse means you take money out of your purse. Disbursement, out of the purse. You have purse-like structures in your joints. So your shoulder, for example, has these fluid-filled sacs around your shoulder joint that are also called the bursa. And if they get inflamed, you have bursitis, and you can't throw a baseball. I don't know if you have ever had this, but this is the kind of thing that professional baseball players have to watch out for, bursitis. So there's more for the pre-meds. The bursae of ophiuroids are open to the outside, unlike your shoulder bursae. They're used for respiration. Excretion can take place through the bursa. Eggs and sperm are shed through the bursae, and in some species, eggs actually stay in the bursae, and embryos and even juveniles might be brooded there. And finally, uniquely among echinoderms, there's a few species that can tolerate somewhat brackish water. So here's what one of these looks like, and here you can see that the oral disc is almost perfectly round, and you can clearly see where the oral disc ends and the narrow, snaky-looking arms begin, unlike a starfish where they kind of shade into each other. So that's pretty typical brittle star anatomy. On the left, you've got a cross-section of a true starfish arm. You do have nerves on the underside. You can see the radial canal with the ambulacrum. There's a pair of big ossicles called the ambulacral ossicles. But above that, there's pretty much empty space. That's just the coelom, which may be filled by gonads and branches of the pyloric ceca. If you do a cross-section through an ophiuroid arm, those ambulacral ossicles have gotten a lot bigger. They're taking up most of the space within the arm, and they fuse together to make a structure that looks like this. And this is actually a picture I took with our old scanning electron microscope. This is an ophiuroid vertebra. This fills up most of the arm. There's some plates that cover the arm on the outside, but this is what's in it. And in the middle, you can see the stereom structure. This whole thing is porous. And some parts of it have pretty large holes, and they look very foamy. But other parts of it have almost no holes, and those are the parts that tend to fit together with parts of the other vertebra. So right there in the center, that part that looks very bright because it doesn't have many holes in it, that actually fits into a matching socket on the next vertebra. So these things fit together with this kind of ball and socket arrangement that is superficially like the kind of ball and socket arrangements that your own vertebrae have in your own backbone. And the details are a little bit different, but the upshot is that this makes for a very flexible arm. Don't know if you've ever seen snake vertebrae, but snakes have superficially similar vertebrae that can bend a lot. So do ophiuroids. And again, this is the ambulatory ossicles that have joined together, fused, and taken up most of the space inside the arm. So yeah, that notch in the bottom is where the radial canal would be when this thing was alive. If you look at the underside of one of these, there's actually, instead of just an open mouth, there are 5 little jaws, the tips of which are all pointing towards the center of the mouth. And you can see the mouth is star-shaped. And then surrounding the mouth, you have 10 slits. Those are the bursal slits that lead into the bursae. And there's respiration taking place in the bursae, so water passes in and out. Gametes may be released. And in some species, there's actually embryos are protected and brooded inside the bursae. Typical brittle stars are in an order of the ophiuroids called the ophiurida, but ophiuroidea also includes an order called Euryalida, the so-called basket stars. And this is one of them. It's your basic ophiuroid, except the arms are ermagerd, branched very highly. And these guys will basically crawl up to a handy spot and stick out all those arms and filter feed. Typically at night. They tend to be, you can get them in fairly shallow water, but you don't usually spot them during the day. But yeah, that's a so-called basket star because when they extend all of their arms out to filter feed, it creates a structure that looks a great deal like a basket if you're on drugs. Right. Okay, let's see. Echinoids, the 4th class of echinoderms we're going to talk about, include sea urchins and sand dollars, are the ones that you're likeliest to have seen. In echinoids, the skeletal plates butt together very tightly and they imbricate, which means they overlap a bit, like shingles on a roof imbricate. And they lock together to form a very rigid structure. Echinoid bodies are not flexible. They don't have arms that can move independently of the body. You could think of these as kind of like walking castles. And the structure that they make is called a test. And you've seen that word before when we were talking about certain protists. Foraminiferans, for example, have tests. Testa is Latin for a pot. So anything that's solid and vaguely shaped like a pot could be called a test. The test is quite rigid. There's like a couple of weird species that can flex a little bit, but in typical sea urchins and sand dollars, the test doesn't bend. Sea urchins, otherwise known as regular echinoids, have a test that's radially very symmetrical. Irregular echinoids have developed some degree of bilateral symmetry, and that includes the sand dollars, as well as some other groups like heart urchins that I'll show you in a bit. Each test, you've got 5 rows of ambulacral plates interleaved with 5 rows of interambulacral plates. The ambulacral plates have holes, and the holes are where the podia come out, the little tube feet, and the interambulacrals are where the podia don't come out. Very profound, I know, but I'll show you this in lab tomorrow. And the mouth contains 5 jaws, that collectively form this thing that looks like, you know, the grabber claw in those games where you try to maneuver this claw to grab a stuffed animal and drop it into, you know, into the bucket and for a prize. The things that my son never seems to win, although he demands, you know, countless quarters every time we go out to an arcade, you know, the kind of thing. Um, yes, the mouth looks something like that, kind of like that grabber in the game, although it's not used to pick up stuffed animals. It can be used to eat small food particles or for some sea urchins to scrape on rocks. And the apparatus is called Aristotle's lantern. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, among other things, sometimes called the founder of marine biology. In some of his books on science, he described marine life, and quite accurately. He had clearly gone down to the docks and been talking with the fishermen and done some dissections. He describes things like squid anatomy in ways that shows he was looking at the real thing. If you know what squid look like, you can follow his work quite well. Greek scientists are sometimes stereotyped as being, you know, doing a lot of deep thinking but not getting their hands dirty, and, you know, trying to reason about the truth rather than going out and observing. But Aristotle was a really good observer. There's some things he got wrong, but he got a lot more right, and he doesn't always get credit for this. And he was the one to discover the jaw apparatus of sea urchins. So there's what a typical one looks like inside. The digestive system's in brown. There's a mouth on the underside. It kind of loops around the body and ultimately drops into an anus that opens on the side opposite the mouth, up at the top. Surrounding the intestine and the anus, you've got 5 gonads that open into gonopores, little pores up on the aboral surface. The gonads, by the way, when they're, you know, sexually mature, can get quite large. The water vascular system here is shown in dark blue. There's an intake. There's a madreporite very close to the anus, and that leads into a stone canal that leads to a ring canal, and the ring canal leads to 5 radial canals, and the 5 radial canals kind of run up the interior sides of the test, and they give rise to tube feet. And this may not be really clear from the drawing, but if everything goes well, oh please, oh please, oh please, I'll show you what this looks like on live sea urchins. I hope, maybe. And then in bright green down below by the mouth, you see there's a nerve ring with 5 radial nerves, although not much of a central processing power there. These are not very intelligent organisms, I'm afraid. If you look at this one, I chose this picture because you could actually see an ambulacrum here with the spines removed. You can see this kind of double row of pairs of holes running up almost right up the middle of this picture. And the plates that have those holes make up an ambulacrum, right? That row of holes. And there's 5. And in between the ambulacra, you've got a double row of interambulacrals. And in this species, the interambulacrals have those big tubercles that are round and have this kind of ball and socket in the center. That's where the large spines attach. This happens to belong to a group of urchins where the spines are very large and very thick, but there's not very many of them. They're affectionately called pencil urchins because the spines can get almost as thick as a pencil. And I just picked this one because in this case, it's fairly easy for you to see the difference between the ambulacral plates, which have the little paired holes, and the interambulacral plates, which have the big bumps where the big spines attach. If you're interested in commercial value of all of this, there's actually a fishery in Northern California for the Northern California purple or red urchin, they call it, Strongylus introtus franciscanus. There was almost no fishery for it in 1976. By 1985, they were pulling in 30 million pounds of urchin. That caused the fishery to crash, but it recovered in the 1990s, and last I looked, it had stabilized at about 3 to 4 million pounds. If you are curious as to why anybody would spend money fishing up sea urchins, they don't look very tasty on the outside, but the gonads are considered a delicacy, particularly in Japanese cuisine, where they're called uni. I don't think you can get these at most sushi bars. Last time I was there, which was a long time ago, Mount Fuji in Conway did not have these on the menu. They're kind of an acquired taste, and I don't think they would be very good shipped a long distance. You probably have to be fairly close to the ocean to get uni. But they are considered a delicacy, and uni has been found to contain a neurotransmitter called anandamide, and that is the neurotransmitter that affects the brain's cannabinoid receptors. You know, not that any of you would ever touch the stuff, I'm sure, but if you were purely hypothetically to smoke marijuana, right, your THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, is the compound in marijuana that binds to receptors in your brain. And you might well be wondering, why do we have receptors in our brain for THC? I am tempted to say it's because God intended you to smoke pot, but I'm not going to say that because I might get in trouble. But in fact, you naturally produce a neurotransmitter that binds with those THC receptors. And it's called anandamide. Ananda being Sanskrit, meaning something like universal bliss. So yeah, you make natural substances that affect your brain's cannabinoid receptors, and they're also found in sea urchin gonads for some reason, which suggests that, you know, if you smoked enough sea urchin gonads, you could probably get a pretty awesome high. But I'm not actually recommending that. Please do not go out and smoke a bunch of sea urchin gonads. I could get in trouble for recommending that. Okay, there's a sea urchin where the top has been broken off, and looking down on it from the top, the gut has been mostly removed, but in the center, that thing that looks like a wheel is the top of Aristotle's lantern. That's the top of that jaw apparatus. And surrounding that, you can see the 5 gonads, which are large and bright yellow. Chile is also a place where they're considered a delicacy. Those gonads are supposed to be really good on toast with olive oil, red lemon juice, red onion, parsley, and a good white wine, like a Sauvignon Blanc. Maybe you'll get the chance to try them sometime. And then that wheel-shaped thing, that's the top of Aristotle's lantern in the center of the urchin. And there's what an isolated Aristotle's lantern looks like. You're looking at the top of 5 jaws that all kind of meet in the middle, and with the teeth moving apart and coming together, again, like a complicated version of that grabber claw in the coin-operated game. It may be made of up to 70 separate ossicles. Sand dollars, by the way, have this too, although it's not nearly as large. And if you crack open a sand dollar, you'll get 5 things that look a little bit like flying birds. That's a simpler version of Aristotle's lantern. When I was a kid, we used to vacation at Fort Walton Beach on the Gulf Coast of Florida, and the souvenir shops would sell you sand dollar skeletons. They're rather, nice white color once they're bleached. And they would sell you these plaques that showed you a sand dollar skeleton, and they showed that if you broke it open, you got these 5 things that look like doves. The reason that the tourist shops gave was that this was a sign of the crucifixion, because sand dollars had 5 holes in them corresponding to the 5 wounds that Jesus suffered in his hands, feet, and side. They had this petal-like structure on them, which had something to do with flowers and Easter. And if you cracked one open, they had 5 doves in them, which was a symbol of the Holy Spirit. Uh, I don't choose to argue with anybody's piety. If that religious explanation is nice, then it's nice. But the 5 doves in the sand dollar are actually the 5 jaws of Aristotle's lantern. And if any of you ever go to souvenir shops in Florida or maybe elsewhere, maybe the Bahamas for all I know, you might see plaques with the legend of the sand dollar. And it's nice that they look like doves, but what they are, in fact, is jaws. So there. Right. Echinoids also have pedicellariae, and this is a Pacific species called Toxopneustes, affectionately known as the flower urchin. There are spines on this thing. You can see them, but they're very short, and they're covered by these pedicellariae, which all have purple spots in the center. Each one of those things that looks like a purple flower is actually a single pedicellaria. Don't be fooled. There's 3 little jaws, 3 little piercing jaws on each one of those pedicellariae. And these pedicellariae pack a neurotoxin strong enough that human deaths have actually been reported. Be a heck of a thing to put on your tombstone. Here lies so-and-so died from poison bites of a sea urchin. You really have to be almost trying to die from that. I'll put this out for anybody interested in neuroscience. Neuroscientists prick up their ears whenever they hear the word neurotoxin, because a lot of neurotoxins, although deadly, can be used in neuroscience research, because what they'll often do is very selectively block one particular set of channels or one particular aspect of how a nerve cell functions. So they can be very useful in working out how nerve cells work, because they'll block, one set of channels but not another. So you can zap some nerve cells with a neurotoxin and then measure what it makes them do or not do. Right. There's a living irregular echinoderm. It's called a heart urchin. The test is vaguely heart-shaped, but this one is completely covered in spines. A lot of echinoids actually use the spines for moving more than anything else. They may have tube feet, but they may not really use them for motion very much. A lot of sea urchins can wedge themselves into crevices in the rock using their spines. These heart urchins can burrow using their spines as a bunch of tiny little legs. And this is why they're called heart urchins. This is what the test looks like with the spines off. The ambulacra are found only on the dorsal side, and they form 5 petals. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the 5th looks a little different. It's in the groove of the heart. This means that irregular echinoids don't have tube feet on the ventral side, so they can't move using the tube feet. They move swinging their spines back and forth. And in the very center, if you look closely, you can see 4 gonopores right there. Those are the pores that the gonads will open into. And then finally, that's a live sand dollar. This happens to be a Pacific coast species. I've picked these up in Mexico and in Southern California. Now, if you buy sand dollars at the souvenir store, they're very smooth and very white. The test is very smooth and white if it's been bleached, or if you find it washed up on the beach. If it's washed up on the beach, the living tissue rots and the spines all drop off. But a living sand dollar is covered in very short spines. It almost looks like velvet. And the spines are typically pretty strongly colored. I've seen purple ones and black ones. And these typically burrow in sand. If you're walking on a beach, you usually don't see living sand dollars unless you swim out a little bit and then go digging for them. What washes up on the beach is usually just the bleached white tests with the living tissue rotted away and the spines all fallen off. There is those stars that you see are the 5 petals. On the opposite side, there's a mouth. And most starfish are just deposit feeders. They'll just kind of creep through the sand and pick up whatever small organic matter they can find and pass it to the mouth. This particular species will actually partially bury itself and make use of the water currents around its body to trap small food particles. It's shaped in such a way that if a current flows around it, a little vortex, a little swirling zone happens to pop up right where the mouth is, and that traps food particles that the dendraster can then feed on. So kind of a neat little trick there. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. There we go. All right. The original is the best. What, is that a reference to my singing ability? Oh, Fantasia. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, we were talking about that. Yeah, that has always been one of my favorites ever since I was a kid. And the Mickey Mouse as the Sorcerer's Apprentice is a lot of fun. And of course, you can't beat the music. Right. If you've got any questions, put them on chat. I'm going to turn this off and go get some more coffee, if you'll excuse me for just a minute. And when we come back, we'll be finished with the echinoderms.